Hello, everyone. This is Giacomo Beccari speaking, and I'm very glad to welcome everyone again to the new episode of our ESO Cosmic Duologue series. It is a special pleasure today to welcome to and to introduce you to a topic which we feel particularly important and for which we have for long the desire to have a duologue about this. And then we found three excellent and outstanding professional scientists that are gonna tell us and a lot about this topic, which is the use of metric in evaluation processes. And the question is, what's about it? Is it what the good and what the not so good about it, and how to solve some of the open issues or problems related to the use of metrics in evaluation processes. So as usual, a very quick technical details. So the video is streamed on YouTube. So people are participating, everyone is participating on YouTube. So please be patient because there is always a 30-second delay between the event itself, which is happening live, and the event as it's seen on YouTube. So keep posting your questions and comments on the chat, on the channel, on the chat of the YouTube channel. Where we can, and then we will pass the comments or questions to the moderator and then to the speakers. So you can send your question using the live chat, or you can send your question also using a dedicated form that is available on our pages, duo.eso.org. You go there on the right-hand side, you see a menu. There is questions that you click. You can type in your question and send it. And we will see it in real time, so you can pass it to the moderator. With that, and then of course the event is streamed on YouTube and it's going to stay there, so you can also be watched later. Having said that, it's a big pleasure for me to introduce the moderator of the event, Michael Hill. I want to say since the beginning, first of all, I really thank Michael, Rochelle, and Anna, who are the speakers, to accept our invitation today. And I say that I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to meet them. And I also witnessed some discussion that they had while we were preparing for the event, and it's really a pleasure to listen to them. So I'm really happy now to be the one introducing at least the moderator. So Michael Hill. Michael Hill has a very diverse and interesting curriculum and educational path. He studied biology and theoretical physics at the University of Zurich. Then Michael got a PhD in pharmacology at Oxford University. Later, as a postdoc in neuroscience at Caltech and at UCLA, University California, Los Angeles. Then he started 3 different startups, 2 of which very successfully. And since 2016, Michael is department head of strategy at the Swiss National Science Foundation, where Michael is in charge, in particular, of various initiatives, exactly of which part of them related to improve and develop evaluation processes, new strategy for evaluation processes, and other initiatives. So with this, I will, in fact, I would like to leave the floor to Michael, who can then introduce the event. And thank you everyone for attending and enjoy it. Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giacomo, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to you, the organization, the audience, our 2 speakers also for letting me participate in this presentation. I'm very much looking forward to it. I join Giacomo in my excitement because we have really got 2 excellent speakers here today with Anna Hatch and Rochelle Fritsch, and I think it's going to be a very interesting session. Before I introduce them formally, I just wanted to give a very brief introduction to the topic of metrics. My own background is not in astronomy, like Giacomo said, so this will be a more general introduction to metrics as such. I'm going to just quickly share the screen for a few slides, and I trust that you tell me in case you cannot see my slides. So just very briefly, the question really is, why metrics in the first place? Why are metrics a problem, and where do they arise? And I think the core problem is not necessarily metrics themselves, but simply the fact that nowadays there is just this vast number of research being published. So since 1665, so since sort of the dawn of publication, or since the first journal was published, there have been more than 50 million science papers. And so the problem really is, how do you find the research that you need? How do you want to keep up with it? How do you have a sort of an overview? And Craig Shirky said it's not really an information overload. People often lament the fact that there's just too much research being published. It's more a filter failure, right? Having a lot of research out there is great, but we need to be able to kind of handle it. Neil and Wu then said our only options are either to publish less or to filter more effectively. And there are some people who cry, or who call for less publications, maybe sort of bigger papers with less. I personally think it's really down to creating better filtering mechanisms. Maybe metrics is the solution, maybe it's part of the solution, maybe it's contrary to the solution. We shall find out today, but it certainly is a part of the current situation, and maybe part of the current problem. The most famous metric, I think, is the journal impact factor. I'm sure all of you are very much aware of it and what its problem is. Nonetheless, I like to just sort of show it once more, because when you see it presented like this graphically, I think it just drives home the obviousness of the issue with the journal impact factor. So for example, in the upper figure, you see the average, or the number of papers of a certain citation, which had a certain number of citations in the Journal of Nature, and below you see the same for the Journal of Science. These numbers are already a few years old, but they haven't really changed all that massively. And what you can see immediately is that the distribution is massively skewed. This is not a normal distribution, right? In both journals, you can see that the bulk of papers published have around about, I would say, between 10 and 20 citations. That's sort of the average, or not the average, but the most papers in Science and Nature get cited about 10 or 20 times. There are a few all the way on the right-hand side which have over 100 citations. Spike on the right. But this is anything but a normal distribution, and sort of statistics 101, like all of us have learned, probably on day one in statistics, that you just cannot use the mean as a representation of a normal distribution, and yet that's exactly what the journal impact factor does, right? So the average impact factor in Nature in that year is 38.1, and that's its journal impact factor, where what you should use is, of course, the median. And yet, this is still widely accepted as a sort of metric. And it's just blatantly wrong. It's just, you should not use it. It's wrong, and we all know it's wrong. Nonetheless, this is from 2019. 75% of research institutions admitted to using the journal impact factor as a metric in careers assessment. 75%. This is throughout Europe, through a questionnaire in Europe. And there are other metrics as well, Hindex and so on, that are being used, but still the journal impact factor reigns supreme, and these other metrics are not necessarily all that much better, and I'm sure we'll have more discussion on that today. So the situation is that there are many competing standards in metrics today, because everybody wants to sort of replace the journal impact factor, right? So everyone says this is ridiculous. We need to have one universal standard that covers all these specific cases, because this is just outrageous. So then they create yet another metric, and then of course we have even more metrics out there. There are very, very many metrics. And the issue with them is often that they measure what is easy to measure. Metrics usually measure something, they count publications or they count citations, which is easy, right? But it's not necessarily what's interesting. There are other things which we want to know when we evaluate research, like the quality of research, for example. How much and how well has this person worked in their career, for example? And that does not necessarily correlate with a number as simply calculated as the number of papers or citations. So it's very important to remember with metrics that they usually show you what they can easily measure, but it's not necessarily what we need or like. And then this is just my final slide. For me personally, a very useful paper that was published on this topic is the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. And it gives some good guidelines. So if you are interested in maybe improving the way metrics are being used at your institution or in your organization, then this is, I personally think, a good place to start. Now, let me see if I can stop sharing the screen. Okay, can you, here we go. All right, I think, are we back? Okay, great. So that's just a quick sort of introduction from my side about general idea with metrics, right? There's a lot of literature. Metrics can be useful as a filter. We're still hopeful that we might find better filters. AI and other technology might help us with that. But for now, they are being used widely, even the problematic ones. And they are, however, very limited in what they measure, and it usually focuses on publication numbers. Now, we've got two people here to present to us these topics in a bit more detail and then to have a discussion on them. And it is my great pleasure to first of all introduce Anna Hatch. Anna is the program director for the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, which is really a sort of a driving force and has been a driving force pushing against such practices as the journal impact factor. She is 2021 RADA Distinguished Alumni at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse for her work on academic impact. And before joining DORA, she worked at Research America, which is as a science policy, which is a nonprofit advocacy alliance to increase public and policymaker awareness. Originally, she had a PhD in biochemistry and was a NSF graduate research fellow. So she's got her academic background, but she really worked in very important, and still today works at the very core of these sort of organizations that are focusing on this topic. And Anna will give us first a presentation. After that, she will be followed by Dr. Rochelle Fritsch. And I will also quickly introduce her now, although we will see her talk a little bit later. Rochelle is a scientific program manager in the research policy team for Science Foundation Ireland. And she leads the development of responsible research assessment policy and effective quality and diversity inclusion policy, as well as the communities accelerating gender equality and institutional change in research and innovation across Europe. She also is a lead in funding organizations for gender community of practice, which shares knowledge and experience in gender equality in research and innovation funding. And this is, of course, also a very important aspect where metrics can cause sometimes more problems than they solve when it comes to gender equality. Her academic background was also a PhD in sustainable agriculture from University College Dublin, and she did over 8 years of research in academia with a focus also on data science and evidence-based policy making. So both our speakers not only know academia from the inside out, but they also know it from the outside in. They both work with these very important topics firsthand and in very important organizations. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So I'll hand over to Anna first for a presentation around about 20 minutes. And then when you're done, Anna, I think you can hand straight over to Rochelle. But to the audience, I would like to say, if you have any questions as we go along throughout Anna's talk and in Rochelle's presentation, just keep them coming as in real time, because that way we can sort of start collecting them and so on, and then start discussing them straight after the talk. So keep those questions coming in the chat, and I will hand over to you, Anna. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. And presenter mode. Wonderful. Okay. And again, I trust that if my slides aren't sharing properly, someone will alert me to that fact. So thanks again, Michael, for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today. And thank you so much to Giacomo and Henri for the invitation to participate. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So before we jump in, I'm going to give you a view of sort of reimagining research and research assessment from DORA's perspective. I just want to go through a few quick disclosures. It should be evident now I am the program director for DORA. We're an international initiative to improve the ways that research and researchers are assessed. We're supported by a number of different research funders, publishers, and scholarly societies. The American Society for Cell Biology is our administrative entity, and that will become very apparent why in the next couple of slides. So to really seed my talk, one thing that I want everyone to sort of contemplate and sit with is this idea of what advances academic careers doesn't necessarily advance science. And this was an idea sort of introduced by Naomi Albert-Bond and Wim Pixton in a lovely paper that came out last year. And the thinking behind this tension is that things that push careers forwards right now are typically publications and prestigious venues. You saw the data that Michael showed that 75% of institutions in Europe are still using GIF for academic career advancement. Grant funding is another thing. The stuff that's really pushing the science forward include things, and again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but open science practices, teaching, collaboration, research reproducibility, research integrity. So there's a tension going on for researchers and how research is conducted versus how they're going to get rewarded for their efforts. And this tension plays out at higher levels too. So for example, universities as institutions are constantly needing to balance external pressures, such as, again, grant funding, as well as university rankings to attract students with their internal values. So for example, these are things that typically crop up in a university mission and vision statement. So learning, discovery, collaboration, societal impacts, how inclusive is an institution. And what DORA is trying to do is to reimagine how can we think about research assessment in such a way that it aligns with an institution's with these academic values. So DORA's vision, very briefly, is to advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment globally and across all scholarly disciplines. And we have a couple specific objectives as well. So to raise awareness of responsible research assessment, to facilitate implementation of good practices, to catalyze change and to improve equity. So to give you a brief history of DORA, the idea for DORA came out of the 2012 annual meeting for the American Society for Cell Biology. And I think this is a really great story because it sort of illustrates like the power of sort of having conversations as a community. So there were a group of editors and researchers who on the poster floor were talking about how GIF was being misused for research assessment and the effects that it was having on the academic workforce, and also the effects that it was having on the ways that research was being conducted in research culture more largely. And this led to the creation of the formal declaration, which was published in the following May. And in that time, from May 2013 up until 2017, DORA was constantly accruing signatures as really a call to action for the community to rethink their use of the journal impact factor and eliminate it for purposes of hiring, promotion, tenure, and funding decisions. And then in 2017, with the help of a lot of organizations, DORA transitioned from a statement of intent to an active initiative campaigning for change, realizing that having a declaration is a really good way to attract attention, but you need a much dedicated effort to support and facilitate that culture change that we'd like to see. So to date, I checked this morning, and more than 19,400 individuals and organizations in 145 countries have signed DORA. And I think that's a testament to how much the wider academic community cares about research assessment reform and the collective sort of investment in wanting to make a change. And the word cloud here that I have is a representation of the organizational signatories that have signed DORA and where they're coming from. Again, I think it really underscores that this is an international initiative. So DORA is most famous for our general recommendation about journal-based metrics. The declaration itself has 18 specific recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. This one is targeted more broadly to the community. The others are focused on specific stakeholders, for example, funders, academic institutions, metrics providers, publishers, and researchers. But this one is really the one that anchors the whole declaration, and that is not to use journal-based metrics as a surrogate for the measure of the quality of it in individual research articles, or to assess an individual scientist for hiring, promotion, or funding decisions. And the other point that I just want to make too is that so DORA is one of many initiatives that are working to improve the culture of research assessment. So DORA came out in 2013. It was followed by the metric TIDE in 2015. Michael introduced you to the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics that was written by a set of bibliometricians, which I also highly recommend if you haven't seen that. In 2019, there was the Helsinki Initiative on Multilingualism. And what this one is looking at is really how can we recognize and reward contributions to research that are published in languages other than English. And then in 2020, most recently, we see the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Researchers. And this is coming from a research integrity standpoint. So how can we align our assessment with research integrity? And these really are just a couple of many other initiatives. I wish I could list them all, but the sense is that there's a lot of many groups in the community working to make a collective impact for researcher assessment. So the journal impact factor is a measure reflecting the annual average number of citations to recent articles published in the journal. Michael did a great job introducing why this is problematic, that we're using the mean instead of the median. And really briefly, before I go on into some other details, I just want to point out sort of the metrics toolkit. If you're not familiar with this resource, it's a great website that lists a number of metrics and indicators used in research assessment or for scholarly publishing. And it tells you what they are, how they're calculated, what are some use cases, and what are their limitations. So that's been a very helpful resource for me. So we know what the journal impact factor is. We know that it's being used very widely across Europe and across the world. But why is this not a great thing? And again, the key point here is that journal-based metrics provide information about journals, not necessarily individual articles or researchers. And we know that their citation distributions within journals are highly skewed. So I'm not going to belabor this point because Michael did a great job introducing it. But this, we're looking at an average and not the mean, and we know that there are outliers that can skew. And then the last couple points is that, the properties of the journal impact factor, they're field specific. And it's a composite of highly diverse article types. So it includes research articles as well as reviews. And because of that, it means that journal impact factors can be manipulated or gamed by editorial policy. In some fields where reviews are cited more frequently, by increasing the number of reviews you publish increases the journal impact factor. So that's sort of why journal impact factor isn't the greatest. And then just to briefly walk you through H-index, which is another indicator that's frequently used in research assessment too. So for example, if I have an H-index of 10, I have published 10 papers that all have been cited 10 times. If I've published 10 papers, 5 have been cited 10 times, and 5 have been cited 9 times, then my H-index is 5. And the folks from the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University have a really great infographic discussing the H-index and why it's not the best for researcher assessment. And I'm going to sort of briefly summarize that. And one is that it's sort of dependent on career stage. So the more advanced you are in your career, you're going to have more papers and more citations. And comparing those to junior researchers who will have fewer papers and fewer citations. So that's a disadvantage. And also comparing across fields that have different publication and citation densities. So high density fields are going to have a lot of papers and citations, so your H index will go up. In the lower density fields, you're going to have fewer papers and fewer citations, again, so your H index will be lower. And this really becomes a challenge because it can lead to unfair comparison. Again, sort of like I just illustrated, it's favoring researchers with longer careers. And it's also favoring researchers that are in those publication and citation dense fields. And it also has sort of these other consequences where it's rewarding bad publishing and referencing behavior. So it's incentivizing researchers to get your name on as many papers as possible. It promotes excessive self-citation, and it also, the behavior sort of asking other researchers to cite you frequently. And then what I think is most important and what numbers can't capture is that it renders some of these really important contributions invisible. And this is something that the journal impact factor does as well. So it's not capturing information about leadership and vision. It's not capturing information about collaborations and teamwork or teaching and mentorship, collegiality or research quality. So how can we do better? And one way is to integrate other contributions into evaluation. And one way to do this is through sort of narrative CV style statements. So and this is going to become sort of a much larger theme later on, but just to leave you with that piece now. And before I move on to that, sort of, I want to briefly point out that the creator of the H index has also sort of recognized that it has unintended negative consequences that need to be addressed within the academic community. Okay, so if these indicators have limitations, how can we evaluate research in a more holistic way, taking into account things that the metrics can't capture? So DORA, one of the projects that we released in December, is a repository of case studies documenting institutional change. And it looks at sort of key elements of the change process. There are 10 case studies now, 7 of them are coming from academic institutions. So very briefly, I'm just going to walk you through our case study for the University of Ghent. So Ghent really decided to reimagine their research assessment process because they were feeling that these quantitative evaluation models were contributing to this culture of publish or perish, and they wanted to get out of that cycle. And so what they did was develop a vision statement for evaluating research. And then from there, created a career path and evaluation policy for professorial staff that has an emphasis on goal setting and coaching. But what it also did was it introduced narrative self-reflections, where researchers are able to articulate their research achievements as well as their ambitions or plans for the future. And now these narrative self-reflections are things that are coming up in other organizations are experimenting and piloting with too. So for example, here, I just have a quick slide showing that a lot of organizations are using narrative structures to capture some of these the information that metrics can't. So for example, the Charité University Hospital, they're now asking researchers about contributions to open science, engagement with stakeholders. The Royal Society developed the resume for researchers, and it's now being adapted by a number of organizations, including UKRI, the Luxembourg National Research Fund, Science Foundation Ireland. You're going to hear a little bit more from Rochelle. And other organizations have been working on sort of creating their formats too, such as the Swiss National Science Foundation. And this really is sort of a mechanism, like I said, to capture some of the information that metrics can't. Okay, so what type of information can these things capture? So the resume for researchers, that's really detailing contributions to the generation of knowledge, the development of individuals, contributions to the wider research community, and contributions to broader society. And in addition to sort of capturing sort of more complex sets of information that numbers can't, what these things also do is they help instill standards and structure into research assessment processes. And this is something that came out of a meeting that DORA organized with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 2019, where 5 design principles to help institutions experiment with and improve assessment. And the idea being, again, that narrative CB formats, they're giving structure, which helps encourage sort of even comparisons of applicants across a pool. And then the last thing that I want to bring up is that bibliometric indicators also support some of these institutional implications of common biases. So in the middle, sort of, I have a list of different biases that can crop up in research assessment and the institutional implications of these. And one, of course, is that we gauge value by association. And so, for instance, highly rated or prominent journals often are going to get the benefit of the doubt based on our familiarity with them and based on their reputation. So if there's a journal that's less familiar, you're not necessarily going to give that researcher the same attention as you would with, oh, they published in this well-known journal. I know that, I'm familiar with that, I trust that. And then I think, one of the other things that I want to point out here is that objective comparisons are not necessarily equitable. So we've been talking, I think one of my themes is, what are the things that numbers aren't telling us? And we know that with Campbell's law, once metrics are seen as a way to gauge value, they start to lose meaning as objective measures, in part because it can lead people to game the system, which we talked about with GIF, how that can happen. Not necessarily from sort of the publisher perspective, but also from the researcher perspective. And this really becomes problematic because when you have an outsized impact on how people are rewarded, it can increase the temptation to focus on this narrow set of activities, which leads to a narrow path of success in research evaluation. And I think this ties very nicely back into sort of the tensions that a researcher has to grapple with what advances my career versus what advances the science. And in the last couple of minutes left, I want to introduce something a little off topic, but I think also merits discussion and maybe could come up later on. And that is the idea that metrics are convenient because they're fast and they're easy to compare. But are there other ways to capture information about contributions that are equally as efficient and provide sort of faster review time than perhaps reading an entire narrative section might? And so one thing is the contributor roles taxonomy or credit. It gives 14 roles or ways that people participate in a specific research project that leads to an output. So there's an excellent article by Andy Tay that was published in Nature Index. And it's looking at how researchers themselves, so again, coming from the researcher community, have started to create new ways to articulate their contributions. So what this is showing you here is it's a snapshot of something that someone had put on their CV. These are the different roles in which they had contributed on the y-axis to the paper. Or yes, and then on the x-axis are sort of the different publications that they were authors on. And the black boxes indicate where they made a contribution. So very quickly, you're able to look at this get a handle for how a researcher has been contributing over time. Although what this doesn't tell you, because it's always sort of what are the limits of what information can and can't tell you, is the quality of these contributions or the impact that they've had. But I think it's an interesting way to sort of filter and organize information sort of at the author contributor level. And with that, I want to say thank you so much. It's a delight to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to our upcoming discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna. Brilliant presentation. Like I said, we'll go straight over to Rochelle's talk. I just want to quickly remind the audience again to please just keep the questions coming as we're going through these presentations, and we'll pick them up afterwards. So if there's anything in there, any questions you have, comments, thoughts, anything, just type them into the chat or ask Giacomo through the other channel he introduced. But with that, straight over to you, Rochelle. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. And I really enjoyed listening to Anna's talk as well. I'm here today to talk about a funder's experience and to really probe into the question is, the use of metrics in the evaluation process and added value or a damage to science. And so first, I want to pose a few big questions today. Metrics have been used as a proxy for excellence in research, but are they appropriate? And what makes excellent research? What makes an excellent researcher? And how do we measure and assess these? So I want to give a little bit of first an introduction to where I work. So I work in Science Foundation Ireland. So we're the largest research funder in Ireland. We fund STEM research and we fund individual, collaborative and center scale awards. We also promote STEM engagement and education. We're pretty much a typical funder who makes awards on the basis of competitive merit review. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what our aims as an organization are. So Science Foundation Ireland aims to fund excellent researchers who do excellent and impactful research. But what does this actually mean? And specifically, what is impactful research? What is impact? And I'm going to go through a little bit of history of impact and how we've come to use our definitions and try to define these for you. So I just want to give a little background. So Science Foundation Ireland first started to look at impact for a number of reasons. And one of the main ones was after the economic downturn, we had to look at the value for money of our investment. So as a result of the economic downturn in 2010, there was an increased pressure on us as an agency to demonstrate relevance in our investment. This was especially challenging as much of our investment were made to projects involving basic and applied research, so low to mid TRL. In developing our new strategy for research and development at the time, we extended our focus to include impact. So the pressure was on us to show that the outputs of our investment in STEM could support the struggling and recovering economy. In other words, we had and still have a duty of accountability to our investors, the taxpayers. So within this new agenda 2020, which is our strategy, our old strategy, we have moved on from defining from the first pillar being to fund excellent research to fund excellent and impactful research. And so from 2012, this has been in all of our competitive review process, and scientific excellence and impact have had equal proportions in this. So how did we do this, and what is impact? So back in the early 2010s, Science Foundation Ireland and Ireland were involved in the Small Advanced Economies initiative. And we worked together with six other countries to look at broadening the scope of impact and looking at ways to measure and assess impact in public research programs. So to help us define this research program, to help us define this, we worked together to form a publication, the objectives of which were to provide a common language for the concepts surrounding impact and impact assessment across a number of countries, to share the lessons in implementation of impact evaluation, particularly in grant evaluation, to help improve analysis of impact through the use of tools and indicators to gather better information across all impact areas, and to provide opportunities for the use of common indicators so we could enable cross-country comparisons for future analysis. And so in Science Foundation Ireland, we had this balance of excellence and impact within our review process. And we defined impact to be the demonstrable contribution to excellent research that excellent research makes to the economy and society. And so impact can be short or long term. It can be economic or non-economic. It's difficult to measure. And that's one of the challenges. And it can be non-linear. And originally, when we defined impact, we were thinking of it kind of in the more economic sense because of the challenges of the economic downturn at the time. But over time, we've really expanded our framework to describe impact in a much wider breadth of terms. And so we now use this, these 8 pillars of impact, and our researchers must write an impact statement which can cover any of these 8 pillars. So those pillars of impact could be economic and commercial, societal, international engagement, impacts on public policy and service regulations, health and well-being, environment, impact on professional services, and impact on human capacity. So how do we measure impact? Impact is part of our evaluation process, and each researcher who applies for a grant within SFI must write an impact statement. And this is where they articulate their planned and potential impact of the proposed project at the application stage. This is then reviewed by an international peer review panel, and applicants or awardees must report on their impacts in their annual reporting and through their midterm review and an impact statement, as well as provide case studies. And we use these then to make sure that our investors, the taxpayers, are paying for impactful research that helps contribute to Ireland's society and the economy. So the main questions that researchers are asked is, who will benefit from this research? How will they benefit? And when will they benefit? And so these impact statements all relate back to those 8 pillars that I showed in the last slide. So I want to bring this back to more, some more recent topics that we've been talking about today. So if you look at the San Francisco Declaration of Research on Research Assessment, you can see some of the language that we're using is similar. With the evolution of our impact framework, we found we were moving away from traditional metrics, where we're pushing our applicants to reach down and think about the broader holistic deliverables arising from their research. And this sounds a little bit like DORA, making sure that we're not just using metrics, but have this wider breadth of research outputs. In 2018, SFI became a signatory of DORA, and we started to implement the DORA principles throughout our portfolio, but actually it really quite complemented the impact work that we had done. And these principles kind of sound a lot like the pillars associated with impact. So in SFI, what are we trying to achieve? Well, we aim to fund excellent researchers who do excellent research and also positively contribute to developing the next generation of talent to the society and economy, to the research community and a research culture. In this more holistic view, metrics don't really work well for assessment. We need to assess these broader areas where metrics aren't necessarily appropriate. And so we're changing the way we define excellence and excellent researchers, moving to a more holistic view of researchers' achievements. And I'll show you how we do this within our grant evaluation process. So within an application to SFI, most SFI programs have these 3 broad areas: the quality of the applicant, the quality of the proposal, and the strength of the impact statement. These are usually equally weighted to form the final score. By implementing DORA, SFI is looking at the way that we are assessing applicants, and this has evolved to bring together the broader impacts of an applicant's research history to the fore. And as such, we guide the reviewers to take a more holistic view of the applicant's achievements. And we've really used we've used some work that's been done in the Royal Society with the resume for researchers. And I'll show you how this works on the ground. So when we implemented this new iteration of our DORA CV, we reviewed our existing CV template. And we had a DORA CV template before, and where we looked at key achievements and research excellence. But we really wanted to have both the applicants and the reviewers focus on these 4 broader areas of research outputs. So the generation of knowledge, the development of individuals, the contribution to the wider research community, and contributions to society and economy. And you can see here that these 4 areas really map out in a very similar fashion to the impact framework. So when SFI first implemented impact, we were looking at the impacts of the research we fund, and now we're assessing the excellence of researchers by the impacts they've already achieved. Within our framework, metrics are not permitted except citations, and applicants can be deemed ineligible for review if they are included. We've also removed the total publication count from all of our review documentation. And in addition to this, applicants can describe their most relevant research publications and the individual impact of these papers. And this is strongly guided from the resume for researchers, which was a great piece of work that the Royal Society had done. We also wanted to look at the review process to make sure that we were we had a way that we could improve in the future. So we have a 2-stage review process to look at the quality of an applicant. In the first stage, the reviewers are asked to assess the applicant in those 4 areas independently and actually give a score of 1 to 5 within those 4 areas. This isn't used for this final score, but we're hoping that this will slow the reviewers down and think of the applicants in this broader holistic framework. In the second stage, the reviewer is asked to score the applicant considering those 4 categories, but they're not guided on any way to weight that. And that's the final score that's being used within the evaluation. The data from the first stage will be used to review the implementation of our policy, and we'll have some ideas of how the reviewers are viewing those 4 categories of outputs. And just moving on, just to say, we're really in early days in putting together these new policies. Applicants are still focused on metrics and publication venue in their application, such as Hindex, total publication count, and journal impact factor. And reviewers are still focused on metrics, such as publication venue, when discussing the excellence of a researcher. And so we have been working together by both observing our panels and also talking to our programmatic teams. We've developed specific guidance for sitting panels and postal reviewers to make sure they understand these new concepts. And we know it will take time. When we first put the impact assessment as part of the grant evaluation process, it took a little bit of time to bed down. So we see the implementation of DORA and these principles and challenging the current culture of research assessment as an iterative process. And we will identify challenges and adapt our evaluation process to address these as we go. And the data gathered from this will be used to evaluate our policy and see what next steps we take. But as you can see, in summary, when we're looking at what is an excellent researcher, we can see that the metrics can't really play a good role if we are, going to be catering to our stakeholders, which are the taxpayers. And we need to show that this research is excellent, and the researchers that we fund have this wider breadth and can really contribute to the next generation of talent and also contribute to a better research culture. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion now.
Great, thank you also to you, Rochelle. 2 very interesting talks. There's so many topics to cover. I'm sure we have a lot of things to discuss. I'm going to start the discussion with a very general question, which we got out of the YouTube channel by a guy called Michael. And he says, we are aware of the limitations of metrics, But his question is, how do you assess somebody outside of your field of expertise? How do you make a judgment? For example, if you're Dean of Science at an astronomer judging academics in biology, where maybe, you know, reading the content of a paper or so on might be a little bit harder. I'm going to ask you, Anna, because DORA sort of says you should focus on the content, but and there are surely many situations where that kind of might not be possible or is very difficult. What would you say to that?
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, absolutely something that DORA recognizes, is that we want to focus on the content, but with the volume, the research papers that are being published, that's a lot of content. So one of the advantages that we see of these narrative formats that ask researchers to sort of articulate their specific achievements is that it can give sort of like a snapshot of what that contribution is. So I think that's one thing that I see. Another thing that I've been seeing that I think could also sort of be helpful is on CVs where people list their publications, having a brief sort of 3 to 4 sentence summary, sort of articulating what was the outcome and what was their role to the contribution. And in fact, you see some journals are starting to do that, where they'll have like highlights and there are like 4 different bullet points. But that's still challenging if it's someone that's outside of your field, right? And so you're then relying on this person's explanation of their work to be accurate. And I think that's where like peer review is also helpful, and being able to build in mechanisms where if it is outside of your field of expertise, how can you have people review? And then this is sort of another topic of conversation, but if we are using peer review in itself sort of is a scholarly contribution. So making sure that people are getting recognized and rewarded for their contributions to the peer review system, be it for academic career assessment, for publishing, or grant review. Okay.
And sort of just in the wake of that and what Anna just said, Rochelle, like it sounds like as SFI, for assessing impact, you guys don't use any metrics. Is there a reason, like, do those impact metrics just not exist? Or like you discussed it a little bit in your talk, but what is the sort of key argument for that decision? Because at least economically speaking, you know, just counting dollars is a very simple metric for impact, which has been used in the past. Like, can you just quickly say something about why not use the metric for impact in that respect?
So for impact, we use indicators, and we do use economic metrics which were you know formed by this small nations think tank. So we do use those, and we would ask our awardees to use metrics to describe their impacts, but those aren't journal metrics. You know, those might be a specific amount of money or a specific number of PhD students who've gone through a research center, certain amount of graduates, or, you know, specific numbers of you know, policy documents or publications or work with the public sector. So we do have them use some metrics, but we don't have them use journal metrics in describing their achievements when they're putting in their applications.
Because this sort of segues into the next question we have coming in from Joe Anderson, and he's asking whether there is empirical evidence, or whether indeed there can be empirical evidence that metrics clearly harm the advancement of the best scientists or the production of the best science. I'll pose that question to both of you. I don't know, maybe Anna, do you want to go first? Whether that is or can be empirical evidence that, because we criticize metrics, etc. Is there some data showing that this is the case?
So I think what this question, it refers to the best science and the best scientists. So I think you need a concrete definition of like, what is the best science? And that answer, I think, is it depends on the situation, it depends on the context, it depends on what you're evaluating for. And that a lot of the, well, trying to think of the best way to say it eloquently. But so I think like it really depends on the context of the situation. But it also, when you're looking at measures like journal impact factor, I don't think it's not saying that research published in those journals isn't excellent. It's saying that there are a lot of other journals also publish excellent research. And I think it comes back to, you're using journal impact factor, which is a journal metric, and you're putting it on individuals. And how can you find things that are more appropriate for individuals? So that, I don't know if that answers the question in a satisfying way, but I would really love to hear Rochelle's take on it too.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a piece of research that was done on Hindex, and sometimes metrics can compound bias within the system. So
Yes.
in a really nice investigation of Hindex, a group looked at how Hindex differed between men and women. And then they looked at Hindex without self-citations. And so when you looked at Hindex just plain with self-citations, there was a significantly higher Hindex for men compared to women. But when you remove self-citations, men and women were actually equal. So I think that's kind of empirical evidence that some of the metrics that we're using are quite biased and can actually compound bias in the system.
I'll just quickly be the devil's advocate here and ask, how about then, we're talking about narrative CVs, there must be bias in narratives as well to some extent. Are we sure that those biases are less harmful in any way, or is this an assumption that we have at the moment?
Yeah, so at the moment, we have introduced the narrative CV format, and we know that there are biases in language when people are writing. We know that there is some bias, but we know that the metrics are, there's a greater risk with metrics, especially if you're trying to increase the breadth of who you fund in your portfolio, maybe people with nonlinear career track histories. We want excellent research. We don't necessarily want Nature and Science publications or a really big H-index. So we do know we will introduce some bias into the system by putting in a narrative format CV, but we think that the risk of that is lower than using the strict metric system. And we also understand that what the risks are, and we're looking at funding research to make sure that we can mitigate some of those risks and really know what they are in the future. And we'll be working on that in the next year or two.
Just another call out to the audience to keep the questions coming in. We've got time, and we've got 2 experts here on the call, so please just keep posting those questions. So Rochelle, you were just saying about nature science, which is the sort of thing that a lot of people go to. Anna, if somebody in an evaluation says this paper was published in Nature, is that already referencing a problematic metric? Does Nature just stand in for the journal impact factor of that journal? Are we not allowed to say the name of journals anymore? Is that a problem, or is that going too far?
I think you can, certainly I think you can say a paper was published in Nature because Nature does publish papers. But where I think this gets tricky is when you use it as a stamp of the quality of the individual paper. And I think, so, I had the slide that listed 7 or 8 different specific biases. And one of them was availability bias. So that's sort of like the information that's top of mind that you're familiar with. So when you're saying, oh, there was a Nature paper, it's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that. I recognize that. And it's not focusing on what was in the paper, but it's the associations you make because of where it was published.
So then we have a question coming in from Pavel Krupa. I think it's a very interesting and poignant question. He says, would Newton be considered a best scientist according to modern standards, given that he was brilliant, but supposedly barely sociable? So if we take in all these sort of soft measurements of impact and so on, are we maybe also running the risk that we are watering down the sort of hardcore of science? And I'll start with you, Rochelle, and then I think maybe Anna also wants to say something to this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the things that was asked when I proposed this policy within my own organization. What happens to these brilliant scientists who don't really mentor people? And I guess the key question is, with public funding, what do we want to fund? You know, are we trying to fund the next generation of researchers and make sure we have a really positive research culture? If we want to do that, we need researchers who can mentor people, who can run labs that are really positive. You know, we need to be able to figure out a way to reduce, you know, some of that toxic environment. And we've seen so many cases recently about sexual harassment or other things. How do we make sure that we're funding not only excellent research, but also, you know, forming that next generation of researchers with a really positive environment? Making sure that the outputs of the research are contributing to the greater society and the economy. You know, those sorts of big questions. And when you start to look at it that way, you might find that you want your researchers and research to mean something slightly different and focus more on that more holistic approach.
So in that case, Anna, Rochelle's just said not only, right? So we want to have a more inclusive way of evaluating, if I may paraphrase, and I think that is obviously very important today. But I can also understand that some people might be then worried that like somebody like Newton or some brilliant individual might then not be given that sort of priority that they would otherwise. And how would you answer to that? How would you kind of dissipate that worry?
Yeah, I think a great example of that is there is a national initiative in Netherlands called the Dutch Recognition and Reward System. It's based up a policy paper that was developed by research funders, academic institutions, and academies, focusing on sort of room for everyone's talent. And I really like this phrase, room for everyone's talent, because when you look at the responsibilities of researchers, the list becomes really long, really fast. And I don't think personally it's realistic to have everyone be an expert or high achieving in all of those different levels. So one of the things that's come out of this initiative is the idea of academic profiles, and researchers can have different academic profiles where you look at all of the different ways that researchers contribute, sort of teaching, research, service. Those are the big three ones. I feel like there's a fourth that I'm missing. But then you can pick sort of a profile that like, I'm going to devote most of my time to research, and then part of it's going to be on civic engagement. And then you'll be evaluated based off of that profile. So there are very clear standards of these are the different types of profiles that exist within the institution, and here's the profile of where I sit, but I'm still a professor. So it doesn't change your job title, it just changes the slight focus within.
So I think it's a very important point, and a point that I've come across as well in the past, that people then, worry that we might overemphasize these sort of the halo of the sort of hardcore science. But I think also a very interesting statement in that is that Peter Higgs, for example, said, I wouldn't be productive enough for today's academic system. And Peter Higgs is certainly a very important researcher. He didn't publish many papers at all, and he very sincerely believed that, with today's pressure on publications and publication numbers, he wouldn't have been able to do the kind of work he does or he has done. So there's another question we've got coming in via email from Melano Annalisa. Can you comment on the standard metrics of the successful applicants to SFI? Does it correlate with the new selection method?
Sorry,
Rochelle,
yeah, can you say that
question?
again? I missed it.
It says, can you comment on the standard metrics of the successful applicant on SFI? Does it correlate with the new selection method?
We actually haven't done an analysis of our standard metrics versus the way that we are going to be evaluating applicants now. But I will say that we are involved in a project called Granted. It's a European funded project. And it's going to be evaluating this, our first call with this new CV. And that will be part of the evaluation. They're going to look at the productivity of all of our applicants versus the scores and how the reviewers have scored. So I'll be able to report that in future, but at the moment, we don't have that done.
And I also have another sort of specific content question for Anna. You have this word cloud of all the different countries that have signatories, institutional signatories at DORA, and Henry wrote that he had a feeling that it was somewhat like Europe seemed underrepresented in that word cloud. Is that maybe because Europe has lots of small countries, or is there like, what about, I guess maybe more generic, what about the distribution of signatories across the world? Can you say a little bit more about that, and whether, for example, there are indeed less in Europe than one would maybe expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, I think sort of talking about sort of the needed to be specific and concrete about definitions, DORA welcomes signatures from organizations that are committed to improving research assessment practices. Organizations is we have a very liberal definition of that term. So it can include public or private funding organizations. It can include academic institutions. It can even include units within an academic institution, like a library or a specific department. It can also include nonprofit organizations, scholarly societies, journals, and publishers. So I think judging the number of sort of organizational signatories in a particular country doesn't necessarily equate with the work that is being done in that area. For example, a lot of journals have signed DORA because sort of research assessment, we view it as a systems problem. There are multiple stakeholders involved in the system that are all sort of contributing and upholding the typical ways that we assess researchers. And the majority of our signers sort of are these journals and publishers. So I don't think that it necessarily shows a lack of academic institutions signing DORA. Certainly, I think the collection of the sort of smaller countries has something to do with that. But I would also, in looking sort of for terms of evidence of progress, there are a lot of national initiatives that you're seeing emerging, like the Dutch Recognition and Rewards Program. There's also the Responsible Research Network Finland that's working on developing principles for the Finnish community, as well as Universities Norway has been working on sort of a national framework as well. So that's a little bit more context. Again, I'm not sure if it's completely satisfying, but. So
I think, again, I would first of all like to shout out to the audience, because I'm also especially curious if there are specific questions with regards to metrics, etc., that maybe focus on astronomy or that are like field specific. Maybe there are some metrics that you're aware of in your own subdiscipline that people maybe focus more on or something like that. It would be super interesting to hear more of that. So do keep those questions coming. But in the meantime, like from the discussion we're just having, it seems to me that at the end of the day, metrics, etc., it's all about, I think, evaluating research, right? Like, what is good research? And so on the one side, there's like DORA saying, well, you should really sort of read the work that this person has done, read the paper, get a sort of subjective, good personal idea of what is going on and what they have done so you can really assess it. And on the other side, there are metrics, which are, at the end of the day, machine readable, right? They're super quick. You don't need humans to evaluate whether one has a higher metric than the other. And with more like machines becoming more and more intelligent and better at reading and understanding, is the discussion we're having just sort of a child of its time, and in 10, 20 years, people look back and smile at us? Or is this, is this going to change? Is metrics the future, or is there always going to be room for individual evaluation? I'm going to start with you, Rochelle, but then I also hand over to Anna.
Yeah, I think it's so important to have peer review evaluation for quality, especially when it comes to research and researchers. We use international peer review for all of our grants because we want to make sure that, the specialists are assessing, and we want them to read the papers that the applicants have put forward and not just look at the impact factor of the journal. I think, or the H index of the applicant. I think that metrics don't seem very appropriate when you're trying to, I guess, look at the quality of research. As we've seen, it's a proxy for something else. Like the impact factor doesn't really reflect the researcher. It just reflects a skewed amount of data of citations.
Anna?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I last year or the year before, I was on a panel that was considering sort of what is the role of artificial intelligence in research assessment, and can there be a role for AI in the future? And one of the sort of conclusions that came out of that discussion was, as long as sort of humans are developing those algorithms and inputs for the AI, and we come with our own sets of personal biases, how do we know that we're not replicating a system that contains all of the biases that we have? So I think there's a danger in that, in recreating the system in different ways. And of course, that's the danger of trying anything new. So, with the narrative CV formats, I really appreciate Rochelle saying that, we need to do some research on this, and to make sure that we're not introducing biases, because it certainly is a way to provide a more holistic view. But we really need to dig into the details of, are there any unintended consequences? And if so, how do we mitigate them? So we're doing a better job by the researchers.
Okay, so I'm enjoying to see the questions coming up through the chat. The discussion around Newton seems to have sort of triggered a few more comments. On the one side, we have Giacomo, for example, saying, how would we then decide an evaluation process to spot the new Newton? And on the other side, we've got Giuliano Lorio saying that Newton-like scientists are many standard deviations out of the normal distribution. I think we don't need an evaluation process to spot them. They are spotted in any case. I think it's interesting, both these chats and also what you were saying, it points out very clearly that I think there are very different scientists out there, very, very different scientific careers. And so on the one hand, we've got metrics, we've got this individual evaluation. The question to the two of you, sort of coming also from these comments, if we want to find the Newton, but at the same time also maybe want to find the very good researcher who is still important but might not be defining a civilization with their work, is the way forward to have a whole basket of metrics and an extensive evaluation process in person, sort of to tick all the boxes to make sure we don't miss on that? Would that solve the problem, or is that just then an overly bloated, heavy and expensive procedure? I see Rochelle is ready to jump. So is Anna. I'll give this one first to Anna and then to Rochelle.
Okay, so I should preface, I'm not quite sure if I'm going to answer it or throw like a wrench into the question and then leave it to Rochelle to answer. So apologies for doing so, but I think, definitely having like a portfolio type approach is good. When we look at a metrics only approach, so we talked about like things that numbers can't capture, but what we didn't talk about is that metrics take time to collect data. And that's another reason why GIF is automatic, because it's associated with the journal. But when you look at sort of article level metrics, those can take 2 to 3 years to calculate. And if you're a postdoc who is going on a job hunt, you don't have 2 to 3 years to wait for your paper to accrue citations. And then when you think of it also in terms of like tenure, so impact takes time, and sometimes a finding, 15 years ago is just now becoming relevant, but that is past a researcher's, or not, I shouldn't say it becoming relevant, but like, oh wow, and the field has progressed enough that you're able to push it really forward. So then what do you do in those instances where time certainly seems to be a compounding factor in my sense?
Mm-hmm. Rochelle?
Yeah, so I think Anna really handles kind of more of the career type of assessment and promotion type. But when we're talking about grants, I mean, there's different ways that you can assess and grants. Like currently, we have about a third of the marks going to the person, the research, and the impact. But actually, like, you could just mostly focus on the research, the proposed research itself, and take away the assessment of the person entirely. In fact, in some most recent reviews and research, they found that there were a lot less gender biases when most of the marks were focused more on the research and the impact and not on the person. So why do we need to assess the person? Why can't we just assess brilliant ideas sometimes? High risk, high reward. We need to just assess if the person is capable of doing the research or not, but why don't we just reward really good ideas? That should be quality in itself, and it's just another thought process, that there's the idea to weight heavily more on the research, and then there's some other groups who are working on doing a lottery system where you really don't focus too much on the person, and you make sure the quality is well enough and good enough for those projects, and they're lotteried off. And these are different ways that we might be able to, focus either just on research quality or maybe give some new ideas and really high risk, high reward research some thoughts.
So
and I think that's really like underscores. Oh, thank you. I was just saying, like, I think that's like underscores that how you evaluate research and researchers should change depending on the situation that you're in, whether you're evaluating a researcher for a grant proposal or the research idea itself, or whether it's sort of a hiring, promotion, and tenure type situation. And in all of those instances, really figuring out ahead of time sort of what you're evaluating on, and making sure everyone has those same standards of evaluation seems to be pretty essential.
So we have a follow-up question from Joe Anderson, but maybe we just stick with it quite briefly because I'm a bit aware of time. He says, so what about more author-centric metrics? So instead of, we all lament the GIF, so what about something where you have the first author papers, where you have the citations of those papers, where papers of students? We can also see, like, imagine where this could go, right? You could have a super, especially nowadays with computers, you can have a very, very specific sort of cloud of metrics that kind of all come together and give you this beautiful result. Is that problem solved?
No.
Why not?
No, and I don't think so, because so if you have a new metric that measures like the number of times you were first author on a paper, authorship changes, standards and norms change depending on the fields that you're in. So the number of first author papers can mean something very different depending on where you are, but also science is increasingly collaborative. The numbers of co-authors on papers are increasing. So I think it's more important to think about the ways in which each person has contributed to a research project. And so I had the last slide I showed was sort of a snapshot of someone had adapted the contributor roles taxonomy. So it's thinking about specific ways that people are contributing to a project and tracking that. But again, so I think that what that's doing is it's tracking your roles, but it's not necessarily tracking sort of the quality or the impact of that. So it's giving you information about what someone has done, but then it's up to the evaluator to make an assessment based on the, what was I saying? The quality and impact.
So, Rochelle, we have another question which I would like to ask you. It comes from Lorenzo Lovisari. And he says, who has ever been in evaluation panels knows that 5 different people give often quite different grade to a proposal. So that will provide a biased result as well as a biased metric. Just to kind of elaborate a little bit further on that question, there's research showing that indeed different peer reviewers will vary to the extent that a Rorschach test might produce different results. Like there is not a very strong correlation. And people like Lamont, for example, would argue that that's exactly the point. In an evaluation panel, you want to bring together different views and interpretations to come to a result. But could you say a little bit more to that, Rochelle? Like we were discussing metrics. So what about the alternative, the evaluation panel with all those different views? Is that really any better, or is it worse maybe?
Well, I think when we're talking about an evaluation panel, you usually have at least 3 reviewers looking at each grant application. And so, you know, yes, there will be some variability within the scoring of each reviewer, but when they come together and they see those scores together in the second panel, which is the oversight panel that ensures, you know, that everything is standard, we have a second set of eyes to make sure that the grants are all evaluated in the same way. So in all of our grants, we have this 2-stage process where there's we call them postal reviewers and a sitting panel, and they look over that and they're able to assess if someone has been wildly harsh or wildly optimistic about certain proposals. But I guess when you look at the data about assessment of or peer review or assessment of grants, there is a huge amount of error. And we have to think that, you know, that the whole assessment process, I would say, you can tell that the top 10% usually would always be funded. And the bottom 10% would usually always be thrown out. But there's this huge middle bit when people are applying for grants that are very high quality and would probably have variability if they were assessed by different people. And I, you know, whereas we think of the grant evaluation process as this highly rigorous process, but there is a huge amount of error because it has as much error as people do. There are a lot of ways that people are thinking of doing that differently. The lottery is one example. The other example is that you always fund that top 10% and then you lottery the middle. There's a lot of different ideas of how we could fund grants a little differently and how to try to, I guess, remove that bias that people have, because people do have bias when they're assessing. And there is a lot of luck in where you do end up in that in the ranking. But we always know, you know, that there is that kind of order. The top 10% are always usually funded, the bottom 10% aren't. And then it just depends on the funder's budget, on how far we can go down the ranked list, you know. It's
so we have sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, it's perfect.
So we have one more question coming from the audience from Dietrich Bade. This is not an easy question. Are there any metrics that can make the critical transition from knowledge to understanding? Anna, to DORA, you are aware of many different metrics and also developments of novel metrics. Is there any metric that looks more at understanding, generation of understanding, or just understanding itself as opposed to knowledge, or maybe something else along those lines?
Sorry, I was on mute. Not that I can think of off of the top of my head, but I would be curious to know if anyone else is aware of an indicator like that. Rochelle, do you have an idea? Like I can't.
I wouldn't, and I would question whether metrics are actually, you know, measuring knowledge.
Yeah.
It's more popularity, or, you know, citations aren't necessarily knowledge. I guess that would be my
citations, and I think citations can be positive and negative. So some of the reasons that you cite a paper is because you found something slightly different. So there's there's that aspect as well.
So then I'll have one sort of last closing question from my side, and that is, people will, you find that often, especially with very experienced, eminent researchers, they will claim that when they look at a brilliant piece of research, they can judge that it is indeed a brilliant piece of research, and that is quite authoritative in and of itself. And then often that is also related to the criticism that all this fluff around it with metrics and all this nonsense is a waste of time. And I have to say, I understand it. If I read something, I also have this sort of feeling that, good God, this is really outstanding. Do we need all this noise, or can't we just get a few really, top of the line researchers, give them a stack of papers and tell them what should we fund and what should we not fund? I'll ask Rochelle as the funder first, and then I'll give the word to you, Anna, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Well, I mean, that is what the peer review process is trying to do, is give those brilliant ideas, that research proposal to experts, international experts in the area, three per grant proposal, to determine if that research is, really outstanding. And I think that is the safest way at the moment to judge, to judge grants. We could look at other systems as well, but I don't think metrics can capture that at any point.
Anna, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think the piece that I would like to add to this is that a lot of times, I talk a lot of times, and I talked about the concept of time, but when a work becomes influential, changes, and something may not immediately be apparent that, wow, this is amazing. And there are a number of examples of sort of Nobel Prize winning work that wasn't immediately published in Science or Nature. So yes, I think sometimes you can look at a piece of research and you're like, wow, yes, this is it. But I think there are other pieces of work that can still become just as influential, even though you may not know it at the time.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very nice closing statement. I think it highlights the complexity of that is research evaluation. It's something that really isn't that simple, and yet it is absolutely key in academia. It determines who gets grants, who gets a career, who gets an award up to the Nobel Prize, who gets to publish in which journal. Research evaluation is really sort of the gatekeeper in academia. It's a very important and interesting topic. To the audience also, it's important to be aware, and I'm sure many of you are, that there is a very sort of strongly, vastly developing area of research developing around these questions. It's often referred to as research on research. There's a Research on Research Institute that's now been funded across, it's an international institute, it's located in London. So there is empiric research being done on these questions more and more and more. And I look forward to revisiting these questions further down the road as more and more results come along. But for now, I want to first of all thank Giacomo and Henry for organizing this really excellent discussion. Thank you very much to the audience for being here, for all the brilliant questions that have come in. And of course, very much thank you to you, Rochelle, and you, Anna, for excellent presentations and very, very interesting discussion. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day, and I hand over to Giacomo. Thank you.
Yes, Michael, indeed, it was really, really a pleasure to listen to you, and thank you very much to you, Michael, for really excellent moderation and very professional. Really, thank you, and also for the presentation and the answer given by Anna and Rochelle. This was really, it's a bit of I feel a bit sad that we're closing, honestly, because I have a number of questions again still, but okay. This is a very good, this is give us even more, let's say, inputs, because we want to have a dedicated workshop to spend a few more, spread over 2 or 3 weeks, 2 3 afternoons, to discuss some of these topics that were discussed today. So we will let you know soon more about that. But really, thank you very much again, and thanks also for people for stay with us. And with this, we close by saying that from next week we continue with the IPATIA colloquium, which is the colloquium dedicated to early career scientists that is organized by us at ESO. So please stay with us. And the next duologue will be at the end of May. And it will be about the formation, the assembly of the Milky Way. So we go back a bit more on a astronomical scientific topic, but of great interest. So stay with us. And again, thank you very much, Michael, Anna, and Rochelle. Thank you very much for your time, for investing your energies into this. It was really, really a pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much. If you can stay 1 minute with us, I want to just to finish the conclusion with you. But in the meantime, I will close the YouTube video. Thank you very much again. Bye bye to everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.